And we are recording with Dr. Ted Postal, who I was just telling beforehand as I was fanboying about how you were mentioned extensively in Annie Jacobson's new book, Nuclear War: A Scenario. I've read all of her books, and it was just the coolest thing to hear her continually using your name. I was like, I know him. He's a badass. And but for all future listeners, today is Friday, September 13th, 2024, at 2:48 p.m. Eastern time. And we are going to cover the cheery topic going into the weekend of nuclear escalation. And as much as I don't want to, and I don't think anyone does, but I don't think duck and cover works well for propaganda, but I don't think it works well with not paying attention to what's going on in the world. So, Dr. Postal, how you doing, sir?
Nice to be here.
And so what was it the talk you gave earlier, if you can divulge any of that, the talk you
Yeah,
gave?
sure.
Yeah.
It's a public talk.
Okay.
The Right now, the United States is contemplating giving the Ukrainians authority to use longer range missiles to strike inside of Russia. And Vladimir Putin has made it very clear that this authority would be considered by the Russians to be an attack by the United States and its allies on Russia. And the reasons he gives are quite straightforward, that the Ukrainians could not possibly make such attacks without the support of the United States, support in the form of satellite information that comes from American systems for targeting, and technical support for actually programming the missiles that would then be launched in these attacks. And so Putin's position has been very clearly laid out that this is not a decision that is somehow divorced from the United States. This is a decision by the United States to be a co-belligerent with Ukraine, and hence there would be a state of war between the United States and Russia if they went ahead with this decision. Now, just literally in the last hour or so, there has been a report published by Reuters that said that the United States has decided to not agree to this new situation, and this comes literally before the the British the British representative meets with Biden at the White House, literally minutes before they're supposed to get together and discuss this matter. So, assuming the report is correct, and it was actually issued through a White House statement, one can assume it's correct. So, at least for the moment, this decision has been put off or maybe even negated, and that's a very good thing
Yes.
if that's in fact what's happened.
Yes. He's you can see Dr. Postal. He beats you down, says nuclear war is coming, and then he gives you an olive branch. You feel warm and fuzzy. He's
Well,
manipulative. No, but that's
well,
it's I
yeah.
mean,
My concern is very simple. Um, it really doesn't matter what side you're on with regard to this conflict, although I do have views on that, and I am happy to share those views.
sure.
Uh, but um, uh, but what matters is that the world not be destroyed over a regional war that, in terms of the security interests of the West and in fact even Russia, which sees the war as a much greater security concern for them than it is for us. And I actually agree with their point of view on this, which we can discuss. But independent of that, to risk the destruction of modern civilization and possibly the destruction of human life on the planet over something like this is bizarre. It's bizarre and out of proportion.
It's it's not something that you can look at like some, the millionth time there's been some regional dispute between, two sects of, radical Islam, where you can almost, it's almost a meme. You can kind of go, ah, they're at it again.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
Hutus, Tutsis. It's not something, or cartels in Mexico. It's not something where you can go, yeah, in an ideal world, they wouldn't be killing each other, but they are, and whatever. This is, this is going to escalate to, yeah, not just out of control, but it is going to jump up a notch that has never before been seen in human history. It's going to salt the surface of the planet with radioactive cobalt and strontium and calcium. It's going to be the end over what? Ukraine?
Oh,
Over
over
Kyiv?
Ukraine. Yeah, well,
What?
it's well, you know, uh, uh, unfortunately, this war has occurred because of a complete absence of sound political thinking on the part. I'm afraid to say this. I mean, I'm not afraid to say it, but unfortunately, on the part of the Biden administration. I mean, they came into. We now know a lot about the whole situation leading to this confrontation, and the facts are history at this point. In other words, we know there's no dispute over the primary facts that one can trace to the beginning of the Russian invasion. And there's no dispute about the facts of where we are at this moment. There may be people who make statements to the contrary of what those facts are, but the facts are there. And for example, many of your listeners may not be aware, unfortunately, because of the American press and the Western press in general, that this war has now been lost by the West. The
Hmm.
war is over, and it's just a matter of the Russians continuing to do what they've been doing. They already have the massive, um, uh, massive increase in firepower and forces that they need to just roll over the rest of Ukraine. And they have essentially destroyed the Ukrainian army at this point. And it's just a matter of them making a decision to take the next steps. It's just that simple. I mean, it's not that simple, but so the war is basically over. There's nothing at all that the West can do, the United States can do, or Western Europe to stop a military victory in Ukraine by the Russians. It's just over. And now the question is, what kinds of dangerous and provocative things might you do that could lead to an escalation that could have far more serious consequences than the ones we're already facing? And for example, uh, this would be uh, providing the Ukrainians with with this long range missile strike capability would in effect do nothing to Russia, but would be highly provocative to Russia, and would be an act of war against Russia and an escalation. Now, what is the point of escalating unless you have a next step that tells you you have a chance of prevailing in some way or other? You would be escalating, risking a global nuclear war as the next step. So, why would you do this? If you were escalating with the next step of possibly defeating Russia in this war, then you have an argument, then you have a military, excuse me, you have a militarily sound and politically sound argument for escalating, but you have none. There is no argument here for that. So it is a reckless thing to do, and it is a sign. It is I shouldn't say a sign. It's another indication of how poorly thought out the strategy has been for pursuing the objectives of this war, that the Biden administration has had from the beginning. It's just a terrible tragedy. This was a war of choice, not necessity. The Biden administration provoked it, and I can go through the details if people are interested. And the losses are probably close to 1 million casualties, but if you include both Russian and Ukrainian casualties for something that did not have to happen. This is not a war where you can say there was a necessity perceived by both sides, and it's one of those human tragedies that will play out, and it's not clear what anyone could have done about it. This was a war of choice, and it was done with the mismanagement of Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. And history is going to make this clear because the facts that I can lay out, if you're interested.
Yeah, no, lay them out.
Yeah. Well, what happened is, let me just start from the earliest beginnings, and is when Gorbachev unilaterally decided that there was no point to this confrontation between the East and the West, and he essentially dissolved the Warsaw Pact. He was talking to the Western leadership, and there was agreement by the Western leadership that that the confrontation between Russia and the West was over. There was no ideological divide at that point, and that Gorbachev would allow the West to do what it wanted to do, which would be to allow East and West Germany to combine together to reform the country of Germany. And in return, the West agreed that it would not expand NATO eastward.
Mm-hmm.
There's this famous statement of
not 1 inch.
not 1 inch further east. Now there is.
Sorry. Can you really just like put that in the most elementary terms? Because a lot of people legitimately don't know that there was an agreement to quote not go 1 inch further.
Well, what the argument that is used to say that this was not an agreement was that there was no treaty signed at the time. All right. Now, this is like saying, I asked you to do something, you did it. Let's say you paid me money for it, and then turning around and saying there was no agreement, that we didn't sign a contract. Well, there is a contract. It's implicit in the actions and results of those actions. The results of those actions were the Warsaw Pact ended, and Germany was allowed to reunite from East and West Germany. And there are hundreds of documents between Gorbachev and the leaderships, different leaders in the West, saying they agreed there was no purpose to any further confrontations between Russia and the West, and that there would be no expansion of NATO. It was just, so now these hundreds of documents are trivialized by simply fraudulent academic arguments and actually fraudulent policy arguments. In fact, these documents were not available because they were originally classified, and the debate opened up about what really happened when they were declassified. So, in fact, these people who were saying that it was not really an agreement, the people in the government who were promoting NATO expansion, were shown to be lying. Those documents are available. All you have to do is go to the George Washington archive and look at them. They're there for you to read, anyone who wants to read them. And it's very clear that there was an agreement not to expand NATO, that there was no longer any adversarial relationship between Russia and the West, and there was no reason to expand NATO because the Eastern European countries were no longer needed by Russia as a buffer between the East and the West. Although, if the West wanted to expand its uh, developmental help to Eastern Europe, which was economically in behind the West, that would be okay. Gorbachev was very clear. If you want to provide help to the West, I mean to the East European countries, help them develop economically, we have no objection to that. But we do not want a military alliance against us moving right up to our border. In fact, the reason that Russia had kept the Eastern European states as a buffer was because of its long historical concern about the West invading the East. If you first of all, it happened in World War II, uh, Operation Barbarossa, when Germany
Hmm.
invaded. It happened in World War One, where it wasn't necessarily the specific. It was a series of agreements and alliances that led to the West having a war, Germany in particular, declaring war on Russia, and then doing great damage to Russia during World War One, and of course the Napoleonic invasions. And unlike Americans, Russians have a very strong sense of history. And actually, Americans have a very strong sense of history, although our history is shorter and our history is more ethnocentric. You ask the average American what they think about the attack on Pearl Harbor, you're not going to get a fuzzy, warm reaction from them like it was okay.
Mm.
And so the Russians, all they asked was that don't create a military threat on our western border like the one we felt we had at the end of World War II. And we reneged on that agreement. And that's a big deal for the Russians.
And to interrupt is you also have to understand the number of deaths. It's not nothing small. The United States lost 425,000 soldiers. The Russians lost, I mean, it's loosely around 27 million.
Right,
It's
right.
it's an order of magnitude times two. That's for any trauma we have where we go, hey, the reason why we were so powerful in response to 9/11 is because we had this happen before in Pearl Harbor, which is justified. We have D-Day, we
Yeah.
have these mass graves, and those are all justified. It's not removing the justification for that trauma from World War II. But you then have to multiply it by roughly, what, 420 times 10 is 40 times what, 6?
Yeah, and,
So, I
and it's a
mean,
smaller country in terms of population than us.
so they lost almost 60 soldiers for everyone we did. So it doesn't negate our, trauma of World War II and why we have such a powerful military and why we, still have bases in Japan and Korea. But you have to understand is that applies to Russia too. And why wouldn't they look at something like Ukraine the same way we look at something like Cuba? And we go, yeah, JFK was right to almost go in there and bulldoze them. Don't come close to our borders. You have to extend that same empathy or at least abstract understanding to, hey, man, people don't like it when there are belligerent forces on their border. It's
Well,
just
I
what it
think
is.
your reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfect mirror image for the Russians about what the
Sure.
United States was trying to do with Ukraine. So in 2008, there was this conference, a NATO conference in Bucharest, and the United States pushed the Europeans against their will. The Germans and the French both disagreed with this American, but the United States owns NATO, and they declared that Ukraine was eventually going to become part of NATO, that they were going to try to do this. And then they also declared that Georgia was also going to be part of NATO. And Putin and the Russian government in general made it absolutely clear that this was a red line for the Russians. He made it transparently clear. Now, this occurred in April of 2008. In August of 2008, the Georgians attacked South Ossetia and Abkhazia, these breakaway provinces that have been problems for the Georgians for hundreds of years. So this was something that's been a festering problem. But they attacked these areas, and there were Russian peacekeeping troops in those areas. Those peacekeeping troops were in there by agreement with the Europeans. I mean, it was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and the Russians were performing an international peacekeeping role there. And the Russians probably were not totally innocent, to be clear on this. They almost, it's clear that they knew that something was going to happen. Georgia's been so close to Russia for such a long time that it wouldn't have surprised me if they knew as soon as the decision was made that this was going to happen, that the Georgians were going to do this. It was a stupid thing for the Georgians to do.
Yeah.
They were encouraged to believe that the West would be behind them. And the Russians said, okay, they struck back. And they stopped advancing when they were 40 kilometers from Tbilisi, and Tbilisi was being evacuated. And there was nothing between the Russian forces and Tbilisi. There was literally nothing to oppose them. And they just made it clear that we are not going to tolerate this kind of thing. Now, given that in April of 2008, NATO encouraged this belligerence on the part of Georgia toward Russia, you would think that they got the message. But no, not at all. So in 2014, the United States was involved in encouraging a coup in Kiev, where extremist elements, ultra-nationalist elements, took control of the Ukrainian government. Now, this is a problem. This is a pattern that you can quickly identify in the way the U.S. intelligence community has worked. We have this internal secret army that does these dirty things in other countries that the American people have not had a chance to speak about or to review. So, for example, we talk about spreading freedom to other countries. Well, these extremist elements that took over the Ukrainian government, within one day, I want to underscore this, one day, they passed a law that basically took away the rights of between 15 and 30% of the Ukrainian citizens who came from Russian backgrounds. I mean, Ukraine is a multi-ethnic country. There are big groups of the largest group other than Ukrainians themselves, the Western Ukraine, are the Russians, because the eastern part of Ukraine was Russia, and it was transferred in 1954 in a bureaucratic transfer to the oblast, the province the province of Ukraine. So this was a Soviet system. It was just, so it was no big deal at the time because the Soviet government was the one that was overseeing, it's just like, you know, uh, instead of Washington being the capital, Philadelphia is the capital, and but we're all in the same government.
Hmm.
So it was no big deal. Then we have this Ukrainian government that starts in 1991, and in August of 1991, and because of this historical situation, maybe correctly, maybe not, I have no view on that. The eastern Ukraine is considered Ukraine, this new country. This new country has roughly 30% of the people in it that are, in one way or another, deeply connected to Russian culture. They speak Russian as a second language, and incidentally, both languages were legal in Ukraine at this time. They have their own church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They send their children to schools where the children learn Russian, including Ukrainian. They learn about Russian culture. They have newspapers published in Russian. They read books that are published in Russian as well as Ukrainian. They have this multicultural aspect to them. It's no different from the Latino population in the United States. And if Latinos want to speak Spanish among themselves or read Spanish documents, that's not an issue. It's an issue of human rights. Maybe they should speak English too. I'm actually an advocate for
Same.
that. I'm not an advocate for everyone speaking their own language. I actually disagree with that argument.
I think that's awful. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
we speak English.
Yeah.
My grandparents spoke Russian. I speak English now. I'm happy to speak English. I want to speak English. English
Yeah.
is the country of the United States.
Yeah.
Is a language. So I'm not into that. But I think if people want to speak Greek or they want to speak Russian at home or French or
Yeah,
German or
go for it.
whatever,
Do
it's
whatever.
it's a human right. It's
Yeah.
accepted as a human right. And all of a sudden, these ultra nationalists, and they are ultra nationalists, decide that 30% of their population has no rights to practice and to embrace their ancestral background. Well, that's unacceptable. That's a violation of the UN Charter. So, not a word is spoken by the United States about this. We're still screaming freedom, right? We want democracy in Ukraine. What kind of democracy disenfranchises 30% of its people from their rights as citizens? And the Russians were concerned about that, just as we have been concerned when Americans get attacked abroad. We do not allow that. Americans intervene. We have a long history of that. The Russians basically said, please don't do this. Recognize the rights of these Russian speaking people, culturally Russian people, to respect their culture. Of course, they want to be Ukrainian. They're Ukrainian. That's all right. That's your business. It's your country. But do not take the rights of these people away. And in fact, what happened is the West started arming Ukraine and arming Ukraine with NATO weaponry. And those weapons were being used to suppress independent movements that were developed, that rapidly, almost instantaneously developed in the eastern part of Ukraine, because these people were told they no longer have the rights to practice their ancestral culture, and so they declared independence. In fact, there were eight of the provinces declared independence, and six of them were put down brutally, very quickly, by the central Kiev government, and two of them stood the Kiev government off. They couldn't. Now, what people don't generally know I mean, one of the questions I had when I've been learning about this. So how did these guys stand off a central government, in Luhansk and Donbass? Well, it turns out that the central Ukrainian government sent a bunch of troops in to suppress this independence movement, and the troops were all Russian speaking. So they defected to the other side along with their equipment.
Oh shit.
So that's how Luhansk and Donbass initially got quickly armed and quickly had a military force to oppose the central government. It
Hmm.
was people who were in the Ukrainian army who said, "I'm not part of this. These are my people that you're
Yeah.
suppressing," and they just took their badges off. Incidentally, these little green men that everyone was talking about in Crimea, 20,000 of those little green men were Ukrainian soldiers who were Russian speaking, who were who were deployed there. And when Crimea declared its independence in 2014, with the help of Russia, of course, which did intervene in 2014, these guys just took off their insignias and they became little green men maintaining order in Crimea. Those were Ukrainian troops.
Hmm.
So I mean, this is a country that was multicultural, but was dominated by an extremist element that was put in power by intervention of the United States. Now, if you want to see that this is not unusual, uh, look at um, look at Iran. Mossadegh, who was an elected, was a democratically elected leader in Iran in the 50s, wanted to keep the British and Americans from exploiting the tremendous oil and gas reserves that Iran had so that Iran could develop its own capabilities based on, business and trade. So what the CIA and MI6 went in and did is they essentially replaced them. There's a lot of written about this by by bringing in the Shah of Iran, who was a very repressive, anti-democratic, autocratic figure who did everything that the United States and the British wanted them to do, and in return, uh, the Brits and the Americans supported him. That wasn't the movement that wasn't an American and British action to bring democracy to Iran. Iran was already a democracy at that time. We took the democracy away. Chile, Salvador Allende was voted into power. What did we do there? We supported this Pinochet, this neo-Nazi who murdered all, including American citizens who happened to be in Chile, by the way. And they put this murderous dictator in place because they didn't like the fact that Allende was a nationalist. He was a communist too, but he was a nationalist. That's to say, he was going to look out for Chile's best interest, not for allowing Chile to be economically exploited by US business interests. Now, there's nothing wrong with having business interests with these foreign countries. I think it's a good thing. But the question is, do we eliminate democratic governments that are going to look to protect the national interests of those countries for governments that are extremely autocratic, repressive, violent, so that we can exploit these countries for their natural resources and their wealth. And that's what we've been doing. I think if you look at all of these, so we have these claims of democracy, democracy, democracy. They're empty. If you look at the facts of the situation, they're, they we are purveyors of autocratic extremist, violent governments who will do what we want in terms of allowing their countries to be exploited. And that's the facts. Those are the facts. You can read history about it. So what happened is the Russians wanted to stop this violent repression of people of Russian ancestry in Ukraine. Let me repeat that again: of Ukrainian citizens of Russian ancestry, and so they negotiated with the help of Germany and France. Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France negotiated this Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement, and Minsk II, was an agreement that that Ukraine would develop into I'll call them provinces rather than oblasts, because province makes more sense to an Anglo-American person. They would take these provinces, and the provinces would be part of a federal government, just like when the United States was first formed. South Carolina was its own province. Massachusetts was its province. South Carolina could have its local slavery, which was a big issue right from the beginning of the United States being formed as a nation, and Massachusetts would not. And this was the way they solved the problem of slavery initially. Everybody knew that the problem had to be solved at some later time, but the first priority was to form a federal government that had a chance of surviving and growing and reformulating its structure over time into something that would be acceptable to everybody. Didn't mean that anyone was planning for the Civil War, but
Sure.
but that was the thinking on all sides, including those involved with slavery and those involved who were against slavery. Now, this was exactly the kind of solution that that was being proposed through the Minsk Accords. If you want to be able to speak and read Russian and send your children to school so they can read Russian, and of course they're going to have to read and speak Ukrainian too, because that's the nation's, the nation has these two languages which are officially their language. Then you can do it in Luhansk. Maybe you don't do it in some other place, in some other federation or province of Ukraine. So that was the Minsk agreement. The Minsk Accords were supposed to bring that agreement, that arrangement involved, but it never happened. And then it turned out that for reasons I must say I don't understand, it turned out that Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the French president who was involved in that negotiation, admitted that when they negotiated this agreement with Russia, they never intended for it to be enforced. This was a public, I don't understand why they made these statements, but they did. And then the Ukrainians involved also said that it was generally understood in Ukraine that the Minsk Accords would not be enforced, and that the Americans supported the Minsk Accords not being enforced. All right, so if the Americans supported the Minsk Accords not being enforced, then the Americans were obviously not into democracy, because the democratic principles would require that this treaty be followed. So Russia was very unhappy. Putin in particular was extremely unhappy with this, and he talked extensively about this. He said, and this is an absolutely understandable position, because I've had the privilege of working with a whole bunch of people who were diplomats over my career, sort of providing advice and stuff like that. And every diplomat I have worked with, when I've had a discussion with them about sensitive problems that were being negotiated, I asked them, is it appropriate to lie to your adversary? I was against that, but just to be clear, but I wanted to know what they thought. Every one of them said, you never lie to your adversary. You might not say certain things that would trigger your adversary. You might avoid making promises that you cannot keep, but you never lie, because if you lie, you forever lose the confidence
Lose
of your
any,
adversary.
yeah,
You will never be believed again in a negotiation.
yeah, you can never win it.
And this is what they did to Putin. And so Putin said, this is unacceptable. And he kept arguing that you need to follow these Minsk Accords. Anyone who wants to look at his statements about this, you can see his repeated statements. The Minsk Accords must be followed. We need the Minsk Accords adopted. We need the Minsk Accords followed. And then finally, what happened is NATO was training Ukrainian troops, which were not being successful against the Luhansk and Donbass separatists. The central government was not able to defeat them. But what happened is there was a large influx of NATO people training Ukrainian forces, and large amounts of NATO equipment, artillery, armored vehicles, things of that type, injected into into Ukraine, and they upped the ante somewhere in February. In fact, I can tell you, February 23, 24, 25, in 2022, there was a sudden increase in the military attacks on Luhansk and Donbass, a step increase. This can be found in the OSCE documentation. OSCE is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Yeah, I have the charts. Someone wants them, let me know. I'll send it to them. See a step function increase. Well, Putin said that's enough. We're not going to let this happen. And he went in. Now, whether he should have gone in or not, there's honest debate to be had on that question. What I will say from my point of view, and I said this to my friends, I've said this to very good friends who I respect completely, who I disagree with. Very good friends who accept that the situation was bad, but think he never should have gone in. But I've said, if I were Putin, I don't know what I could have done that was different at that point, because it was clear that Ukraine was going to be a hostile power on my border. Now, in January of 2021, the invasion occurred in February of 2022. Our good friend Antony Blinken tells Sergei Lavrov that, well, the Americans think it's okay if we put nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in Ukraine at some time in the future. And it's none of your business whether we do it or not. So it would be like Nikita Khrushchev saying to John Kennedy, it's none of your business if we want to put nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, and if we want to put troops in Cuba, and if we want to put a big army in Cuba with the military capabilities to cross toward the United States. It's none of your business. It's a separate country. Well, I don't know many Americans who would agree that it's none of our business.
Tell that to Curtis LeMay.
There may be Americans who would agree with that, but I think most Americans who are honest would say, no, this is not acceptable.
Can you
And
imagine someone telling Curtis LeMay that Cuba was none of his business? He
well,
he
fortunately,
he would have started nuking countries that had nothing to do with it. He'd sent a
well,
couple to Africa.
fortunately, Curtis LeMay had
He was held
the
back. Yeah,
president had to
held him.
because
I think
he
yeah,
was totally insane. I mean,
yeah.
the
Well,
guy
yeah.
LeMay was
JFK
nuts.
said he said you want LeMay leading the men into war. You don't want LeMay deciding if we go to war.
Right, right. You
He's a
want
pit
him, right,
bull. He's a pit bull.
right, right. He is.
But
He
the
was
the point stands. Imagine saying it.
right,
Yeah, no,
right.
you would have been hit with strategic nukes in yesterday.
So, so that's what started the military operation. Now, the mythology, and let me tell you, I have been, I don't know, radicalized is the right term. I hate to use a term like that, but I have been educated to a new level of understanding of what is going on in the world around me, and I would have to tell you, I don't think I was uneducated before,
Hmm.
but I've got a new level of awareness, and my new level of awareness has come from reading the Western press while using international information resources to find out what's really going on. And let me tell you, the Western press is so irresponsible and biased that it is only, I'm not even sure it's better than the Soviet press was at the height of Stalinist Russia. It
Hmm.
is hard to believe how little accurate information the American people have been getting about this war. We are now, over the last, let's say, month, actually seeing some articles that are either accurate or have information in them that would cause a serious person to wonder what's actually going on in Ukraine.
Hmm.
We actually saw an article just the other day in the New York Times, which has been criminal in what it's been saying before this. They have been absolutely, I mean, there's no way you could justify the coverage of the Ukrainian war as honest journalism from the New York Times, and the Washington Post was similar, but it broke its silence a little earlier than the Times. I don't know what the internal dynamics, because they're two competitors, was that caused the Times to start reporting more of the real news. It's still not truly accurate, but it's more of the real news. And people who read those journals are now beginning to get the picture that maybe things aren't going so well from the American point of view and from the Western point of view in Ukraine. But even the other day, though, the New York Times reports about this invasion of the Kursk region of Russia. It didn't, the New York Times did not really report that the Kursk invasion has been a total failure. Uh, the original uh, forces that were injected into the Kursk invasion was about 11 to 12,000 first line Ukrainian troops. They took those troops from the eastern defensive border where they were losing against the Russians. These were the most experienced troops they had, and they moved them to Kursk, where they made this incursion into Russia. The purpose of that incursion was to see if they could quickly, before anyone realized what was happening, take over a Russian nuclear reactor in the town of Kurchatov. And if they had succeeded, which was an operation that would have been very daring, and might have taken 3 or 4 days, and the hope was in 3 or 4 days you could do it so quickly that the Russians couldn't stop you. If they had achieved that, then they would have an international crisis, because there's an operating nuclear reactor, and they might have been able to bargain. I don't think they would have succeeded myself, but they might have been able to bargain from a position of strength that they did not have earlier. They failed. They ran into a buzzsaw in this town of Suja, I think its name is, where the resistance was much more determined than they expected. And the operation required speed. It required that something happen before the major Russian forces could figure out what was happening and intervene. And they were slowed up enough that the Russian forces realized what was going on and they were stopped. And in the time since about August 6th, when they first came in, um, those 11 to 12,000 forces have suffered about 10,000 casualties. Now, I don't think those forces are down to 2,000. There must, I don't have the data, but there must, I know there were attempts to reinforce them by the Ukrainians. I know that the Russians were intervening with the attempts to reinforce the forces in Kursk, but those forces are now being rolled up. And the net result is the Ukrainians have lost easily more than 10,000 of their best, most capable fighting forces. That's a large part of their most capable forces at this time. They lost 70 or 80 tanks. They lost a whole bunch of air defense systems, first line air defense systems. These were systems like Patriot systems, at least two Patriot systems, which they hauled into Russia, in probably almost certainly in the hope that they could set up enough of an air defense to protect their forces from being destroyed by Russian Air Force. A sensible thing to do if you're doing what they were trying to do. And all of those air defenses have been destroyed now. They brought in a whole bunch of these HIMARS systems to give them artillery support. Essentially, all of those have been destroyed. They brought in hundreds of armored personnel carriers. Those have been hundreds have been destroyed. So what they did is they took all these Western weapons, which was the top of the line weapons they had, that they were using to defend their border in the east, in Donbass, and they took them away to try to go into Kursk. And so now, on the east, they're left with almost nothing in the way of experienced forces and first line equipment. And the forces they're using in the Donbass now are conscripts. These are poor young men who have been grabbed off the street against their will, who have been forced into the army in one way or another against their will. They don't want to fight. They know enough to know about what's going on that it's essentially a death sentence to be put on the front line right now, because the Russians have been so effective in causing casualties in the Ukrainian army. There are at least 500,000 casualties in the Ukrainian army, at least. And so you can't hide that because the cemeteries are full. Cemeteries are doubling in size in a lot of places. So people can see this, they're not stupid. And you give them a few weeks of training, which means that they can barely handle a weapon, and you throw them into the front lines where they're going to be murdered. They're going to be massacred. And if you read the reports that are coming out of the truly independent sources, and there are plenty now, that's grown up. That's one of the magical things of the internet. A lot of bad things, but there are some magical things. Your podcast is one of them, where people are getting other sources of information. And what we find out is that there are a tremendous number of troops deserting their defended positions, surrendering from their defended positions. Some number of them trying to fight and being killed very quickly, because this is a complex environment. This is not, World War II combat was a terribly complex environment. An infantry soldier got killed very quickly if you didn't learn all kinds of little tricks.
Mm.
But in this case, you have all these drones,
Yeah.
you have this artillery. The Russians have a 10-to-1 artillery capability against the Ukrainians. 10-to-1. Artillery is historically the biggest killer
Hmm.
of soldiers. About 70% of the casualties in this kind of warfare have historically been caused by artillery. In addition, the air defenses of the Ukrainian army no longer exist. So you call in a fighter airplane and it's got bombs. There's a target. You're having trouble on the ground dealing with a well defended target. So you call in somebody and they put in a 2,000 or 5,000, 6,000 pound bomb on that target, and he just comes in and he destroys it. And he doesn't. Yeah. Now you worry about short range surface to air missiles against these aircraft. So they sit off at 45 kilometers and they have glide bombs and they drop the bomb and it glides in and it destroys the target. They don't even have to be exposed to short range air defenses. The long range air defenses have already been destroyed.
Hmm.
They no longer exist. So you're sitting on the ground, you pick up the phone and you say, we're having problems. Here's the latitude and longitude. Take them out, please. And it's done.
Mm.
So these Ukrainian forces have no chance, none at all. And they're being slaughtered because Zelensky and his cronies, who are really killing their own people so that they don't have to admit what a bad situation they're in politically, that's so they can continue trying to convince the West to widen the war into something that could easily go nuclear, and would, could their only agenda is to widen the war. And so far, the United States has allowed the tail to wag the dog in this situation. Of course, the United States put the dog in the position where the dog is destroyed. I mean, Ukrainian society will be 2 or 3 generations recovering from the loss of all these young men and some women. You know, if you lose a very large proportion of the people who are going to enter marriages and have children, and this has a tremendous effect
30,
on the social
30
structure.
years. Yeah.
Lonely people, casualty. When you talk about casualties, typically 2 or 3 casualties to every person killed. These people are missing limbs. They have a right to expect to be taken care of. This is a big problem we've had in the United States. We're a rich country. And from time to time, we have found out that our veterans are not being taken care of properly. And that's been a big issue and should be. I'm against these wars, but there's nothing I'm more against than not taking care of our veterans because
Mhm.
we put them out there. They were in wars, in my view, that they should not have been in, but that's not their fault. The fault is the decision makers who put them out there. And they deserve to be treated with the highest quality medical care and psychological support that we can offer as a rich country. Ukraine is not rich. These people are going to languish in terrible lives, a lot of them living and dying and frustrated in the dark and the cold. This is what they're facing, in my view. It's a terrible human tragedy. And all of this for a war that did not have to occur. So if I sound angry, I am.
Mm.
I am very angry.
It's yeah, the level of yeah, they're not just deaths. That's not just someone that isn't gonna go get married and have kids. That's someone's brother. I lost a brother to suicide in 2014. It's been over
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah.
Still fucks me up. Still,
Yeah. It bothers me to
fam
no end.
it family. We still,
You
we
know,
still all, obviously it's much better than it used to be, but that's one. That's one family. Multiply that by a million. There,
yeah.
it's not a it's not just because you can't put it down on paper doesn't make it the complete hollowing out of someone's willpower because their son is gone or because their brother is gone or because their husband is gone. That that ripples until they die.
It has terrible social consequences in a
And
society, not to mention physical consequences. I feel I'm really almost at the level of crying when I
it
start thinking about these people. I must say,
it
I'm
kill
close
dude,
to that.
when I see those clips on Twitter of Ukrainian or Russian, but I see dudes who are 10 years younger than me. When I was 18, I was getting drunk at a frat house, and I see them,
Yeah,
these guys are 18. You see them, they're making the sign of the cross before the drone hits them, and you're like, you, what do you, how do you even,
and the question is why? I mean, if you're defending your country against a true invader,
sure.
then you do what you need to do. I mean, if you look at France defending itself against Germany in World War II, that's
There are,
different.
there are
You can
clear cut,
understand that.
there are clear cut examples.
Yeah,
And
but this has to do with a desire of people who are ideological, ill-educated, uh, don't understand how the real world really works, who, because of the privilege of having gone to a prestige university and being in the right strata of society, have gotten jobs in government making national security policy about things they have no knowledge of. They have not gone up through the system. They have not had experience in the armed forces or in government, and they have not extensive experience in diplomatic services from a low level to a high level. They have not been educated in diplomacy and international affairs. They've sat in a graduate class taught by politicized academics who are practicing what I call academic misconduct, teaching them nonsense that is simply not true, not even accurate history. I just wrote a letter to Stanford, to a Mike McFall at Stanford, and I he has this person, name is Rose Gottemuller. She wrote this letter to to the Financial Times. There is not a historical fact that's accurate in it, and they have her there. She's a distinguished Perry scholar. Now, what is going on here? Why do you call this person a scholar? She's a political hack. She can't even describe the facts of the history. And then she goes on with the facts, the distorted facts of history that she puts in this letter and violates the simple principles of logic with her argument. So she's neither con- consistent logically with her false premises, and she's got false premises. And you slap on her backside title of distinguished scholar. She's not a scholar. She's a political apparatchik. She has nothing. She probably wrote this because there's an election going on, and she's hoping to get a position in the next administration. That's my guess. I don't know. I
sure.
know her for decades, and she just chameleon. Now, why does a university allow this kind of thing to go on? This is also a problem with the administration of Stanford. Why do they give titles to people who are not scholars? You can find a distinguished diplomat, Jack Matlock, the ambassador to Russia at the time that Gorbachev and Baker were talking about, allowing uh, Germany become united. Matlock is a scholar. He's written about this. He tells the truth. You want to make him a distinguished scholar, you review him as you would an academic appointment, You have some academics, you get together, you say, what does this guy talk about? What does he say? Does he know what he's talking about? Yes. Does he make statements that are defendable, that are technically accurate, factually accurate? Do I agree with all his arguments? Maybe not. But is he an indoctrinator, or is he a potential source of education? If the answer is yes, you give him a scholarly appointment. You don't take these people who are just low-level bureaucrats trying to find their way to another low-level bureaucratic appointment and call them scholars. You can put in procedures to protect the intellectual integrity of your institution and bring in the expertise of people who have been practitioners in government. That's a good thing to do. I've been a big advocate for it when I was at MIT. I really believed, and I still do, in bringing in soldiers who have shown that they can speak honestly, and they don't distort the facts, and they often have views that I disagree with, but that's okay, as long as you're not lying about the actual facts in the situation. That's good. It's good for people to see diverse views, but to tell people that this person is distinguished and honorable in this pretentious academic way, we're all, everyone thinks that they want you to believe that we're academics and that, we're honest brokers. That's not true. What these academics have become, these academic institutions have become purveyors of doctrine. That's what the Stanford Center is now. It's a purveyor of doctrinaire nonsense. And that should not be acceptable to the provost and the president of Stanford. So I'm talking to them too when I'm saying this publicly. This should not be acceptable. And yet it is. And this has nothing to do with academic freedom. I want to be clear here. This has to do with the quality and accuracy of the scholarly debate that can inform students who are going to then, many of them will go into government or go into business or go somewhere else and be influential people in our system. Indoctrinating them is and should be unacceptable at any university. And that's not what's going on at Stanford right now. Now, I'm focused on Stanford because I was a senior member of that center 40 years ago. And let me tell you, we had people of every political view who would be honest. If you came in and you spouted nonsense, you were confronted with the nonsense and you were not invited back.
Hmm.
If you had a very different view and your facts were accurate, you were always invited back, and you were encouraged to share your views and debate with us. And that's the way it worked. This was an open forum for people to see a diversity of views and to understand the historical facts and how honest people can have the same facts in front of them, but come up with different ideas about how to deal with it. That's fine. But this distortion of the basic facts and these arguments are, and making these nonsense claims. I had a discussion in January. I lost my temper at a seminar at the Stanford. I haven't been back. I really don't. I can't take it. Where I had a discussion. Let's say after this with this guy Mike McFall, who claims to be big shot because he was a failed ambassador. The Russians bounced him out on his head, because he was such a problem that violated so many diplomatic norms that they said, get him out of here. We don't want him. And but he thinks he's a great guy because of it. So I'm talking to this guy, and I say to him, and of course he's advocating this war in Ukraine. And I asked him, I said, do you know that the war is lost? And he says, I don't know that. I said, how could you not know this? The Russians just took Avdiivka, the linchpin stronghold that they have held on to, that the Ukrainians have held on to since 2014, and they're pouring into Donbass now. How can you not know that that happened? He says, well, have you been to the Pentagon? I said, why would being, open your eyes and read, and do something. So I says, well, what I want to do is I want to get rid of Putin. So I said, Mike, how are you going to do that? You're talking about when you make this statement, you're arguing for a policy. How are you going to implement that policy? He says, I don't know. I say, what? You advocate a policy and you don't know how you're going to implement it. What kind of policymaker does that make you? And he says, well, I'm not advocating policies. I said, well, you said you want to get rid of Putin. That's a policy objective. Get rid of Putin. I may not agree with it. I may not see him as the problem, but we could argue about that. But I want to know how you're going to implement this policy. And of course, he had nothing to say. So I'm looking at this guy. He's running around. You can find him on every big national television program, shooting his mouth off. He doesn't know the basic facts about what's happening in Ukraine, but he's talking about the Ukraine winning the war when they've lost it, and at the same time he's advocating policies for pursuing a war that's already lost, which means that large numbers of innocent soldiers on both sides are going to die for nothing, because now that the war is lost, there is no reason for anybody to die. Start talking and figure out how you can reach some kind of agreement that no one's going to be satisfied with, but everybody can live with, so that you stop the killing. He's not interested in that. He's too interested in puffing himself up as some big guy who stands up for democracy. So how can you stand up for a democracy that takes 30% of its citizens and disenfranchises them and call it a democracy? How can you do that? How can you say that you have somehow created a democracy in Ukraine where people are dragged off the streets against their will and put outside in a combat environment without training, without adequate weapons to support them, to be murdered? That's a democracy? So, this is what we have in the American leadership. And let me tell you, this guy is not unique.
No.
He's not unique. This Rose Gottemoeller, she's like him, talking nonsense. This guy Blinken, he's like him. This guy Jake Sullivan, they're all people. They don't know. They're unable to engage in a debate. You want to say to me, well, Minsk wasn't the greatest agreement. Let's talk about it, But if you want to say, well, they shouldn't have followed the agreement because they made an agreement, and the idea of the agreement, as admitted by these people involved in the original negotiation, was to cause the Russians to delay in taking action so that they can get more NATO support, equipment, and training into Ukraine so that they could continue suppressing the Ukrainian citizens who had said, we're not going to be part of this. How is that a good faith diplomatic arrangement? And if you do that to me once, it's going to be never again. Never again. And that's what Putin's saying. That's why Putin says, we'll talk. We will talk. We're interested in talking, but there's going to be no preconditions for talking unless the preconditions are set up in a way where we are not getting taken advantage of. So, for example, he has this argument he put forward. He calls it Istanbul 2. Well, Istanbul 1 was that the Russians pull out their forces and that Ukraine do certain things. For example, it not join NATO, it not develop a highly offensive military threat against Russia. There are all kinds of details of that could be argued and would have to be hashed out. But they had a framework. Now he calls it Istanbul 2. because he says, we're not withdrawing. You forced us into a war. You reneged. You signed the agreement. That agreement was signed in March, only 4 weeks after the initial invasion by the Russians. That was signed, and then the Americans said, we won't support Ukraine unless you withdraw from the agreement. So they withdrew. So the Russians said, okay, if this is going to take a war, we're not going to work with 90,000 troops. We're going to have 1,000,000 troops, because they came in with 90,000 troops. The idea that somehow they were going to take Kiev with 90,000 troops is ridiculous. It's just a propaganda. It's nonsense. No military person who knows what they're talking about, who claims to you that the intent of the Russians was to take Kiev, knows what they're talking about. Because the Russian doctrine for taking a city with 60,000 armed troops in it, which was the situation at that time, would have told you you need 600,000 soldiers. You need a 10-to-1 advantage. Now, you may not need that today, because what you do is surround it and starve it out. But the Russians said, look, okay, we wanted to get you to talk. We had to talk. We got the discussion going. We had the outline of an agreement. The Americans and the British stopped it. So, and you Ukrainians agreed. So you're willing to put your blood on the line for the Americans, who literally at certain points during the debate, you may have heard this, say the great thing about this war is we can try to damage the Russians without shedding any of our blood. We take the Ukrainians and we throw them into the meat grinder rather than American soldiers. And so what a cynical thing to do. Here's my ally, supposedly, and I'm telling my ally to do things that are not in their interest, that are going to get more, and that are going to cause so many deaths in their own society, that their society is going to be two generations recovering from it. That's what Ukraine is now facing. Now, this is supposed to be what a country as an ally does to you. Who needs the Americans as an ally? It's like Kissinger said,
Mhm.
you know,
Dangerous
to
to
be
be
an
our
enemy of the
enemy, fatal to
Americans
be our
is,
ally.
yeah, and you look at this and you say, how can people live with themselves with this? I voted for Biden. You know, I, I look at him now and frankly, this sounds extreme, but after what I've just told you, you should understand. Oh, yeah, I have my wife telling me I have to go. Um, you, uh, what he's done was, people were tried at Nuremberg as war criminals for what he's done, because he brought about a war of choice. This is a war of choice, not a war of necessity. And people were tried and convicted at Nuremberg on that charge.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid I don't see how it doesn't apply to him. If somebody can go through the details of what we just talked about and show that either the facts are wrong, or that the facts are wrong. I mean, there's nothing to discuss, debate about the logic. Then this is a war of choice. This did not have to happen. Uh, terrible, terrible death and destruction has been done. A society has been ruined for multiple generations, and God knows we could be facing a global nuclear war at this point. And this is what a person who is an honorable individual, who should be celebrated by our leadership, our people. I don't celebrate him at all at this point. I'm finished with Mr. Biden.
Yeah.
Uh,
It-
anyway,
yeah, no,
I,
we'll wrap it up, but I
we
was
have.
gonna, yeah, no, it's I mean, at this
I'm
point,
sorry. I mean, I know
no,
it's a
no,
very harsh
no,
position to
don't be,
take.
don't be sorry for accurately relaying what's going on. It's just, I mean, I think at this point, just thinking aloud, it's like the best case scenario is stop continuing bleeding. We can't undo everyone that's been killed, but you can
Yeah, but stop it.
stop. I
Stop
mean,
it now.
yeah, I mean, Yeah. No, it's not on you. That it's not on you for giving it an out. You can't get mad at
Yeah,
the ER doc for saying like, "Hey, this
yeah,
guy's in rough shape." It's, it's you don't want him to lie. It
yeah,
just is what it is.
yes,
But yeah, in terms of a nuclear war, I mean, if it, if we can de-escalate it from that, then,
yeah,
99.99% of deaths in this war can be still be prevented if we're assuming thermonuclear holocaust. But
right,
not
right,
a sorry for everybody listening. Cheery episode.
right.
Happy Friday.
This is the world. Friday the 13th, I might add.
This is not. This is hey. We didn't start the fire. We're just go enjoy your Friday. It's still
Yeah.
still lovely and yeah but don't shy away from the stuff. But Dr. Postal, thank you so much for your time, sir. I look forward to the next one. And again, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and I love having you on here. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry for your audience that I've had to say
Yeah,
such,
no one's holding a gun to
but
their
I'm
head. They
saying
don't
it
have to
because I
watch.
think they need to understand it because we're about to have an election
Yeah,
and it's time for us as citizens to speak on these questions.
absolutely. No, it's
And
again.
and you and let me underscore, you don't have to agree with me. I
No,
just ask you to look at the facts and decide based on whether you think the facts are accurate or not, and then make your own reach your own conclusions about what the best solutions might be among
yes,
many solutions, none of which will be satisfactory.
yeah, precisely. So,
Yes,
but yeah, Dr. Postal, thank you so much, man. I'll send you this episode. Love to do it again sometime. And yeah, enjoy the weekend.
right. You too.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Bye bye.
Guys, thank you so much for watching.